I'll invite everybody in. Please find a seat. Dear alums, dear friends and colleagues, dear guests, I warmly welcome you to the Hertie School to this year's Alumni Reunion and Hertie Summit. I'm glad that we once again partner with our friends at the Hertie Foundation and connect these two events after a highly successful first installment last year, which not only was a first installment, but was also one of our very first post-pandemic events. And I think we were so relieved to find a way to get together and to have such a nice setting that we really wanted to create that spirit again. And while I know that all of you will certainly want to have time to talk and get to know one another, and possibly already met friends that you are quite familiar with, and throughout the weekend we've placed a lot of occasions so that you can have time to mingle. Let me just see, now that you're sitting here, if we can identify some of you at least by groups. So can you, by a round of applause, let me know if you're a Hertie alum? Okay, now only those that have traveled from somewhere else here to Berlin. Who is actually living in Berlin? Either that's very even, or in terms of sound, it doesn't make much of a difference. Okay, who came to Berlin for the first time to study at the Hertie School? Okay, now I would like to hear sound-wise a difference. Who's been to Berlin before coming to the Hertie School? Good. Who was very happy and enjoyed their studies here at the Hertie School? Who made lifelong friendships? Who fell in love while in Berlin? Oh, don't be shy. Okay, who came here just because you wanted to experience the world-famous Berlin winter? Thank you. Okay, I just wanted to get a sense of the crowd dynamics, but since we were last here together with you, much has changed in the world, and it's always, for me, these annual events are a time to look back. We would say last year we just came out of a pandemic. Now we have to say, unfortunately, we have come to live with a war. We have gone through an energy crisis. We have watched a lot of uprisings, political upheaval in different countries. And I think more generally, these occasions to reflect are the moments where we realize that we live in a time of very rapid change. And that is always paired with uncertainty and skepticism about what will be and what we've known. And the one thing that keeps me motivated during these reflections is that there's a lot of energy and potential hidden under the surface. And what we should never forget is that sometimes it doesn't feel this way, but you are the people that can act as agents of change, no matter how small the possibilities are becoming. And when I look at the Hertie alumni community, I'm always very proud to see that there's so much energy that comes out of your work that lets me look at world affairs with somewhat of a lighter heart. Now, all of you have found your way back to your alma mater, our dear alums, and you are among those that have chosen to pick a career in the different sectors for which we train. You are in the public sector, you're in the private sector, you're in the third sector, and the joke we sometimes say about ourselves is what unites the Hertie School alumni is that they would like to make the world a better place, or they are idealists when it comes to thinking about the things that we can do in order to positively shape the future. Now, whenever I meet you, we talk or I read about the extraordinary success stories that you have gone through. I learn about initiatives, and I'm realizing later that a lot of things that I've just, been familiar with in the newspaper actually included people who are Hertie alums, and I'm very proud, and I'm also very hopeful that we can make it through difficult times because of your energy and your creativity and the rigor with which you put yourself to the tasks at hand. Just next week, we will celebrate the graduation of our class of 2023. And I'm sure you still remember your graduation. Let me do a round of applause, or let me do a show of hands. Was your graduation less than 3 years ago? Raise your hand. So you should still remember your graduation. Was your graduation less than, let's be a bit more ambitious, 8 years ago? That's less than just before, which numerically shouldn't be possible. So if you, let me put it this way. If you are class of 2015 or higher, raise your hand. Okay. If you are between class of 2010 and 2014, raise your hand. If you are before this, raise your hand. Okay, you have the right to forget your graduation ceremony, but I still hope it's in your mind. And what we have at these occasions when we can really celebrate that we're going out in the world is really the energy and the optimism that we have succeeded in something together with you, and that you're going out and you will make your own contribution. And in a way that also means that quite mechanistically, I don't know what the word is, the Hertie community is becoming bigger, the alumni community numerically is becoming bigger, and we grow into a global community that you have helped to organize into different chapters in an increasingly large number of cities and regions in the world, so that we're not just the Hertie School in Berlin, but we really extend throughout Germany, throughout Europe, and beyond into a network of people who have shared a common education and who share some beliefs. So you can be sure that at the graduation ceremony, I will advertise very strongly for everybody who is going over the scene to also become a member and a very active participant in our alumni community. Now, I talked about graduation. Here it is, so that we can say welcome back to the Hertie School with this image. But let me, this is me. I've forgotten to present myself. My name is Cornelia Woll. But let me go to this slide, because I wanted to mention some of the achievements that have struck us in the past, although it's quite a delicate task to list specific alumni achievements, because really when we share, and we do share this every 2 weeks, we share your pictures and the different job moves or the achievements you've been going through. And so throughout the year, to extract some people from these lists that we share and are always quite proud of is a delicate task. But let me just mention here Faruk Tunca, MPP of 2016, who was appointed member of the Science and Innovation Advisory Board by the Federal Ministry of the Interior of Germany, and selected Young GovTech Leader in the Tech category by Tagesspiegel. Background Digitalisierung and Künstliche Intelligenz in Public Deutschland. So that is something that we like to cite, because now we say we have a lot of very good programs in data science and digital technology. We're interested in the digitalization of government, so it's quite nice to see that even beyond what we offer here, this is something that is close to the heart of some of you, and I know Faruk is not by himself. I'd also like to just mention here Robert Leppeny's PhD of 2014, who has my job. So I think that's something that at least I was struck by, because it's quite unusual for somebody with a recent PhD to already be appointed president of a university. He's the president of Karlshochschule International University, and as the president, he has an interesting story, because every university is different. The president of Karlshochschule is actually elected by the students. So he was the hard choice of the heart, is that the word? Not the hard choice, but the choice of hearts by the students of Karlshochschule International University, and I think he will be doing a great job, as he's already started to do. And then finally, I'd like to mention here Gabriel Rinaldi, MIA of 2022, who won the Media Award for Digital Enlightenment by Deutschland, Land der Ideen. And you will, of course, notice I have 3 male colleagues up here, because it's okay to just mention the males. We will have a prize going to another alumni tomorrow, and I'll say more about this later on. And there's a lot of other mentions that we will point out, but these are the 3 that we picked for this slide here in particular. But congratulations to all 3, and congratulations more generally to all of you on behalf of the Hertie community. Now, as we can see here, being an alum of the Hertie School does not mean one is far away from the campus and the spirit of the Hertie School altogether. Quite the opposite. You, dear alums, are a crucial part of the Hertie community, and I'm struck by this every week when I realize how many of you are actively involved, sometimes directly in campus life, sometimes in other parts of our student life cycle, as one says. You've helped us create professional years and internship opportunities. You've offered individual mentoring to our students who can't be more than who really are very lucky to have such a unique network to build their own careers on. And that's, by the way, one of the things that they say mainly attracted them to the Hertie School. It's you. They wanted to be part of this growing network, and they're hoping to work with you and get to know you, and in particular those who are working in fields that they're interested in, to see how you've gotten to where you are. So you open professional doors and you help us forge new partnerships in the academic sphere as much as in politics, the private sector, and civil society, and that all over the world. You've even organized an international conference in India on the future of healthcare, which brought together some of the most important stakeholders in this field. And some of you even returned to the Hertie School to become one of our permanent faculty members, but I'll say more about this in just a moment. So this is an introduction to say we are always very, very glad to see that you keep the ties and that you're actively engaged, and we would like to invite you to become an active member if you are not already, also in another moment this year, and that is the plans we have for next year. We are, let me see if I can already change the slide. No, that's giving it away, sorry. We will celebrate next year our 20th anniversary. So interestingly, I remember when I turned 20, I thought it was a big deal to turn 20. I hope you were quite proud to turn 20. When I tell some people outside the Hertie School is turning 20, a lot of times I get the reaction, oh, that's very young. I didn't realize you were so young, which I think is a compliment. And I also try to invite a particular member important in German politics, and his team told me, yes, he's often invited to university celebrations, but usually it's the 300-year anniversaries. And I said, okay, I'll come back to you in 280 years. But anyway, I think it's very important to also celebrate a 20-year anniversary, because we've really come a long way. And for those of you who've been here over 10 years ago, you will remember how different of a place it was even just 10 years ago. And I think it's very important to take stock and look at what has been achieved. So throughout the next academic year, 2023-2024, we will host a series of big and small events, panel discussions, lectures, dinners, and a big closing conference in 2024. And we do so in a way to celebrate ourselves, because it's nice to celebrate, but also to tell our story. And you are part of the story, so we really want you to get involved if you can. We have a motto, apart from its 20 years. Our motto is looking back to move forward, the world, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we will invite for some thematic conferences all the participants to look back at the world in 2023-24, let's make it simple, 2024, and try to remember what were the stakes that we thought were very important back in 2024. And how are they now? How have they changed? My favorite example is international security. 2024, what year was that in international security? It was the year where everybody was just so struck by how the world has been turned around by September 11th. And we thought that the security challenge of the future would be this diffuse, stateless world of security threats and terrorism. And look where we are 20 years later. We are facing a full-blown military war with tanks and empires as if it was the last century. So it's quite striking if you look at the perception of what the future would be like with these 20-year cycles, how much you learn about what you know and what you don't know, and what it is that you need in order to act politically in this uncertain environment. And I think it is helpful to say, we're standing here now, let's look back at where we were 20 years ago, where we are now, and what does that tell us about the future? Where do we want to be in 2044? And that is the theme of our anniversary celebration year, which is a way to at least get our thinking together. What are the challenges that we would like to tackle in our teaching, in our research, in our outreach? And if you would like to be involved, if you'd like to come to these events, if on certain topics you have something to say, please do join us. Now, the Hertie School is growing, and so this is where I gave away some things to those of you who know the faces here. We are welcoming 2 new professors, 2 young talents who will complement our permanent faculty. On the left, you see Asia Magazinik, who will become Professor for Social Data Science here with us. She's joining us from the MIT, where she's currently Assistant Professor, and she's an excellent computational social scientist with a political science background. And on the right, you see Johanna Alinghaus, who those of you who have been here in 2013 might know because she's a graduate of the Hertie School. She's not a PhD of the Hertie School. It's a thing in universities to not recruit your own PhDs, so she's gone somewhere else. She's made her marks. But we're now able to welcome her back home as a new professor of economics and sustainability. She works on climate governance issues, and I'm very much looking forward to welcoming her in this new position. We're also very happy to collaborate with excellent partners in our endeavors, for example, with the Dieter Schwarz Foundation, who has supported us has decided to support us the last year with a very generous endowment, and that is a new development for us. We are trying to get partnerships with people who will give us an endowment that we can then use to, in a financially stable way throughout time, fund professorships. In this case, the Dieter Schwarz Foundation also supports our development in data science for the common good. And we are in the process of completing the hire of another professor who will certainly join us a little bit later, but we're confident that we will bring these conversations to fruition as well. And the Dieter Schwarz Foundation in particular is interested with the connection, in the connection of data science, the understanding of data science for the common good, that is not just an academic reflection, but that also draws insights on the developments from the developments in the private sector and helps us to give the students an opportunity to possibly take their vision from the homework they have to do to something that could be helpful in entrepreneurship initiatives. So we're trying to bridge this entrepreneurship, data science, and the academic reflection for the common good in the work we will do with the support of the Dieter Schwarz Foundation. And that, in a way, is in the line of what we're trying to do when we say we want to produce science at the service of society, and we want to make sure the Hertie School is a place for many different ideas, independent of where they come from. And for all of this, we need your help. We need your networks, your expertise, your insights, dear alums, because you are the stakeholders of many of the issues where we're trying to grow and widen our efforts and recruit the most talented young people. So you're cordially invited to approach me or any one of my colleagues if you have ideas or initiatives that we can work together on and that we can think through. We really have learned in the past that a lot of the great ideas that were born at the Hertie School were born out of the intersection of what you brought in, what we came up with, and how we could make this meet and have other people benefit from it. And so this is an invitation for these 2 weeks where we can interact in a way that is most helpful. Before I close, let me thank everyone here who made this exciting weekend possible. First and foremost, please join me in a round of applause for Nena Gracheva and her team. Those of you who have not met her, Nena Gracheva is our Director of Alumni Affairs. This is her first summit, so I'm very happy to see that it's starting well. We just need the rain to stop. But of course, Nena was building on the help of her team, in particular Maria Brama and everybody around the Alumni Affairs team who worked very hard every day to make this community come together and have occasions for us to meet. I would also like to thank the alumni speakers and our faculty members who took time from their busy schedules to contribute throughout the weekend, in particular tomorrow. And as I've said in the beginning, but I'd like to say it again because I now see the Hertie Foundation colleagues, Hamas and Enoko, in the room. I very much would like to thank the Hertie Foundation and the Fellows and Friends team of the Hertie Foundation and all the colleagues behind the scene who made it possible for us to do a joint endeavor and who've contributed to making this weekend plans look so fantastic. Now, finally, I'd like to say thank you to the alumni chapter leads, to the, raise your hand or stand up if you're, if you feel that no alumni chapter leads in the room. Stand up, stand up. And, thank you. And the alumni council members. Nobody from the Alumni Council in the room, but they work very hard. I meet with them regularly, and we will meet once more before the summer, because they also spend a lot of time volunteering and making sure you're represented and your voice is heard. And the whole Hertie community more generally has participated as speakers, as mentors, and helping our student recruitment as ambassadors as well. Usually during this opening, we celebrate the Alumni Achievement Award. And possibly you came in order to celebrate the Alumni Achievement Award. But unfortunately, our alumni achiever, Alejandra Leal Vallejo, could not make it tonight. She is coming all the way from Mexico. She's thrilled to get this prize, but the plane did not want to go as planned, so she will make it here tomorrow, or I think she's coming in very late this evening. So what we had to decide last minute is to make sure that we have the conversation with her and I can present her with the prize tomorrow at the summit. So please join us at the summit at the Hanak House at 7, where we will have the catch-up occasion to give her an award and have a conversation with her about what she's achieved. We had to move this, but I'm sure it'll be just as nice to do it in the location where we will be tomorrow. Which means that before we begin with now just the rest of the panel, which is a little bit later, we have more time for the refreshment outside, for the mingling and for the conversations. So with this, I'd like to officially open by immediately opening the bar again, and then we will meet here at the full hour for the panel discussion that starts afterwards. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all, our panelists on stage, the audience here in Berlin, as well as the ones taking part in our live stream, to the opening panel on science and politics of this year's Hertie Summit and Alumni Reunion. The interaction and interdependence of science and politics is complex. It is often claimed that evidence-based policy making and scientific policy advice are becoming increasingly important, and that the cooperation between the two fields should be expanded in the future. As 3 young students in the field of medicine who pursue a career in both politics and science, we're deeply interested in exploring what structures are needed to reach the above-mentioned demands, and how a combined future engagement in both fields could look like. During today's discussion, we want to assess if and how the cooperation between science and politics can be strengthened in the future, what new concepts and structures are needed to do so, and what limits and challenges we meet along the way. And we wouldn't know a better occasion to do so than in the context of the Hertie Summit and Alumni Reunion that unites science and politics under one roof. We are 3 Hertie Fellows of the Mid-MS doctoral program, and we're pleased to present today's panel discussion. My name is Lea Merkel.
And I'm Klara Eglseer, and together with Luisa Mutschler we organized today's event. It is my pleasure to introduce to you now our group of experts. Let's meet our panel. I may introduce Bettina Stark-Watzinger. She is the Minister of Education and Research and a member of the German Bundestag. Formerly, she was chair of the Finance Committee as well as parliamentary manager of the Free Democratic Party. Thank you for being here today.
Pleasure.
Lara Keuck is Professor of History and Philosophy of Science in Medicine at Bielefeld University. She is a former scholar of the Hertie Foundation's Studienkolleg zu Berlin. She is a member of the Junge Akademie as well as a member of the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities. We are very happy to have you in our panel today. A warm welcome to Frieder Vogelmann. He is Professor of Epistemology and Theory of Science at the Adalbert Ludwigs Universität in Freiburg. His research focuses on the field of political theory of knowledge and social philosophy. Currently, he is working on the relationship between politics, sciences, and truth. Thank you for being here today. And last but not least, Cornelia Woll. She is the president of the Hertie School and a professor of international political economy. Previously, she held several leading positions at Sciences Po in Paris. Her research primarily focuses on the economic sociology and the international political economy. Thank you for inviting us to the Hertie School today. I am looking forward to a thought-provoking discussion. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Luisa Mutschler. She is a medical student at the Technical University in Munich and is doing research in the field of multiple sclerosis. Thank you for guiding us through today's conversation.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited moderating today's panel. We intend to structure the discussion into 3 parts. First, we will delve into existing structures, followed by an exploration of challenges and potentials associated with fostering closer collaboration. And finally, we will direct our attention towards envisioning the future. With that said, let's start with a lightning round question to our esteemed panelists. Why is it crucial for politics and science to engage in collaborative efforts? We start with you, Bettina Stark-Watzinger, and proceed in sequential order.
If you're a politician, you have to make decisions. If you're a minister, you have to write laws, or you have to put in programs, and they should be evidence-based as much as possible, taking into account that there are multiple aspects to be considered.
Okay, next is Lara Keuck.
Yes, I do think that there are multiple dimensions that a lot of the big challenges that we are facing in contemporary society have. And so I do think that both science, or the sciences in the plural, and politics need to work together to learn about these different dimensions and to think about possible solutions that can be put into practice.
Thank you. Frieder Vogelmann.
Yes, I mean, I think I cannot add something completely new to this first round because, as was already said, right, we want our political decisions not to founder on the reality. And we presuppose that the scientific knowledge produced by the sciences is perhaps the most reliable knowledge that we have. So it makes sense to use that. The one question that is really confounding philosophers of science is, why is scientific knowledge so reliable? And there's no easy answer to that question.
Okay, we come to that back later on. Cornelia Woll.
I would say that politics and science have the same mandate, to guide us into the future. And in order to do so, they choose 2 different routes. Science guides us in the future by reducing uncertainties through the production of knowledge. Politics guides us into the future through decisions and actions. So ideally, you would make decisions based on knowledge, or you try to find the knowledge of the decisions you need to make. So if they come together, we would probably move into a better future. I'm not sure it always happens, but that would be the ideal.
And there's another similarity. As a politician, as a member of parliament, you're free. And scientists, ideally, are free. So there is some sort of similarity.
Okay, I have to close this first round. I'm sorry. It's just a lightning round question. Thank you for these first statements. Now I turn to you, dear audience. Do you believe that scientists should be more involved in political decision-making? If so, please raise your hand right now. Okay, now let's check in for the others. Please raise your hand if your answer is no. Okay, so most of our audience would answer this question with an yes. To provide a more comprehensive answer to that question and potentially even explore the how, let's step right in. To first gain an overview about the current dynamics happening in Germany, my first question I want to address to you, Bettina Stark-Watzinger. What are the current legal regulations that control the cooperation of science and politics in Germany?
We are relatively free in organizing that. If you think about the last 3 years, if you look at the last 3 years, I think we made a lot of progress in finding also new ways of interacting. First of all, if you look at the pandemic crisis, there was this board, the scientific board, giving advice. The good thing was it was behind closed doors, the discussion, so you have a room of confidence where you can have the discussions, and it had the various aspects, the various dimensions of coping with a pandemic crisis like this, sitting at one table. I think that is something very good. We also see that the academies, for example, we fund certain programs that the academies, that science, in science you have different time horizons compared to politicians. We have to make decisions rather fast. And what we fund there is the academies are good because there's some sort of a meta level, and they can bring together knowledge rather quickly, and we fund some sort of these speedboats in terms of looking what knowledge is there. That is not knowledge creation, but what kind of knowledge is there, and giving advice. And also when you look at, for example, a very, very specific problem that was solved also as a partnership with science was the Gaspreisbremse, where how to structure a complex issue like that, where scientists gave really good advice, and it was not 100%, but quite a bit of it was then actual legislation. So we need the different dimensions of science advice because we have different questions to solve. So you have regular boards, but then again you need sometimes ad hoc advice, and also we have in the legislation process, when a law is passed in Parliament, you have these processes where there's always scientists giving advice, and you have these regular phases where scientists and also representatives from the economy are part of the recommendation process, not the decision process, that is Parliament, but giving the advice. So there are already existing structures. We have established some sort of more agile structures, and we also have, when there's a specific topic, I think it's good, we found good ways. There's still room for improvement, but we made progress in the past.
Okay, so you mentioned different levels science and politics already are engaging. Is the separation between one another very strict currently in Germany, or is it like more of a gray zone?
Well, first of all, due to our basic law, of course, the decision-making body is the Parliament. And I think from a democratic aspect, that is quite important. I also think it is some sort of shield for scientists because they can give advice. But of course, because they are not elected, they are not really responsible. But we've seen also over the past few months that it's quite difficult for the public opinion to distinguish between that, to differentiate there. So we have separate. Well, legally we are separate, except for the bit when it's an integrated part of the decision of the law making process. But I think we grew much more together over the past few months. And what I would love to see is more fluid in and out science coming into ministries and then maybe moving back. So to raise the level of understanding we have for each side.
Okay, so to improve communication and the understanding for one and another. Okay, thank you for the statement. So in order to effectively work like in this dynamic interface between politics and science, education and training are key. Cornelia Woll, that's why I'm asking you, how do academic institutions in Germany currently support the cooperation of politics and science?
So maybe let me distinguish two things. There's one which is teaching and one which is the research part. Let me talk about teaching first. I think we are really dedicated to the intersection of the production of knowledge and its application, because we are a professional school where the application is crucial. And so in a way we want to make sure that whatever we teach can be put into action immediately, either through an internship, through a professional year, or through cases that are real world cases that the students need to operate on and operate with, because a lot of things work in theory but not in practice. Some things work in practice but not in theory. And it's interesting to see what is the realm of the possible when you play with the actual experience. So in teaching, the closeness of these two experiences is very important to us. Now, on the research side, it's much more difficult, and I think the research part is more the core of this panel, because if you have these great insights and ideas, I would say I won't cite a specific field, but some scientists then think, well, I found all the answers, why is it not put in practice? It must be because politicians are stupid or haven't read my work. And it's usually neither one nor the other. It's because a lot of things that might be a good technical solution encounter lots of, for very good reasons, political difficulties that keep it from being put into place. And the thing that scientists are not very humble about is that science doesn't produce, I said it's a way to reduce uncertainty, but it doesn't give you certainty. We try to get closer and closer, but there is always doubt. So it's a method of reducing uncertainty which leaves a lot of doubt. And the problem is that public opinion thinks that science is some sort of, if you put scientists in a room, they can then form a panel that's an authority over the truth. And that is something we cannot deliver. We're not any closer to the truth. We just have insights that should be taken into account so that we anchor decisions, political decisions, in the real world. But the responsibility for these decisions is with the politicians. So I very much agree with what the minister just said. Having a fluid way where we can move in and move back out is probably the best solution. That's my ideal world as well, because it has to be the insights that matter, not the scientists. Scientists are very bad representative of the insights in the field, because you are not an expert of everything. And if you're just on television all the time because people have decided that you are, eventually you just become a political figure without being elected, and I think that's problematic.
Okay, thank you. By pinning out authority of truth, maybe Frieda Vogelmann, you want to step in and explore for us the theoretical concepts behind politics and science.
No, I mean, let me do what philosophers always do, right? Take a step back and look at the questions that we ask and the presuppositions that are hidden in them. And I mean, by the way, I like the idea that comes straight from Marx, right? That we should be a fisherman in the day and then a theoretician in the evening. So if that's the fluidity you are after, okay. Otherwise, I'm a bit more skeptical, because I can't imagine people doing cutting-edge research for a few years, then stepping out of that, doing political work, and then going back and start again at the cutting edge. That's not how it works, and we all know that far too well. But my real worry here is that I think the reason why the overwhelming majority here agrees, of course, that science and politics should work more closely together is that it's very hard to argue for the other side, right? To say, no, I think that politics should ignore science. That's a hard stance to take. And I think it points to a not very precisely formed question. The question is not, do we need more or less? The question is, what kind of collaboration do we need? From which sciences, in which fields of politics, in which way? And I think these are the hard and interesting questions. Because sciences, and you can say probably a lot more than I do, but sciences are vastly different. If you just think of medicine, sociology, mathematics, cognitive science, and archaeology, for example, right? So there is no common idea of science that unites them. In the philosophy of science, we talk about the disunity of science. The unity of science was an idea in the 20th century that has long been buried.
Okay, with the keyword of disunity of science, I will invite my next speaker, Lara Keuck. So you are a board member of ALIA, the European Federation of Academies, representing over 50 academies from 40 countries. What is actually what is their want? What do they want to implement in politics with their scientific background?
Yeah, so now I have to give kind of like a historian of science sort of answer, like going first kind of like back to the founding of ALIA in 1994, which was really a European project. And it was like the main idea was to just have sort of like a network of the different academies of sciences and humanities to like, well, get to know each other and to like explore connections. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, the whole structure of ALIA changed a lot with a mandate from the European Union to become more active in science-based policy advice. So ALIA heads the SAPEA program, which is the scientific advice mechanism, policy advice mechanism through the academies. And how that works is that the European Parliament comes up with certain questions where they would like to have the advice of the European academies. And then there is a scoping paper produced, which kind of like sets the question, and then with the help of all these different academies, we're looking then for experts in that field, which can be academy members or also not academy members. And then they establish a working group, which normally works together for a year, and they put together then an evidence report, which has like several hundred pages, and talks about like that scoping question, which then goes back to the European Parliament, and there there is a separate group of scientific committee which kind of like reads that report and translates it again to the Parliament. So it's like it's a very complex process, and I think it's both an interesting option, but you also see that there is a certain picture of how science, and I mean like in German we have like this more encompassing concept of Wissenschaft, which is science and humanities, and really kind of like more broader, how that works. And from my philosophy of science point of view, I'd say that the setting of a question is something that is like an intrinsic scientific activity, because as we heard, of course, like the production of certainty and the establishment of evidence is just one kind of activity. And the other one is that often science does not reduce uncertainty, but actually produce more uncertainty, because we ask questions, right? We explore what is not known. We sometimes come up with like completely different perspectives on the object in question that it creates actually more difficulties. And so one interesting example is maybe that there was a current report that was published was on sustainable food systems. And there what the working group did was, I think, really interesting, that they were actually in their report addressing the scoping question, but also questioning it and saying, well, you already limit this question so much to the kind of food system production that is in place, that you do not take sufficient attention to the alternatives of, for instance, local communities producing food, which could offer really different solutions. And so they were simultaneously addressing the question and providing then a review of the available evidence in very different scientific fields. So I think that example maybe just illustrates that it's not necessarily the case that evidence-based or science-based policy advice makes things easier.
Okay, so as you're working as a person who gives political advice, scientific-based, and also as a scientist, do you like keep these two fields separated personally, or is there an intertwining of these for you in your daily work life?
Well, I'd say that I'm not very active in giving scientific policy advice. I'm kind of, for instance, my work in ALIA is then that we are looking at the working group composition and the procedures that were taken to produce these evidence reports were made in the way that the statutes are saying it should be made, and that they are reflecting the principles that we've set ourselves, for instance, with respect to diversity, both geographically but also disciplinary, but that it's balanced. That's something that's very important, that you don't just have kind of like single figures who are very active in their research field, but also have kind of like a very maybe kind of like a biased standpoint, that you look that that's the case. So it's more than sort of like on a meta level, right? Organizing, it's more institutional work in that sense. Setting the stage that that is possible, but not, it's not that, I mean, it would be completely out of my expertise to say something about sustainable food systems, right? So, but I think that this kind of like institutional work, I mean, it sort of like structures a lot of the process, how it's made. And again, it makes things on the one hand more complicated because it adds stakeholders, it adds gatekeepers. But on the other hand, we might ask, well, what are the alternatives, right? If it's kind of like politicians just picking out a scientist where they read in the newspaper, oh, that's like interesting. That's maybe something that from the perspective of the scientific community, we wouldn't really feel comfortable with that, right? So that's why I think there is kind of like a certain role to play, for instance, for the academies in this kind of work.
Okay, so in the context of ALIA, it's like a topic-related decision, what kind of sciences are asked for recommendations. And I want to come back to Frieda Vogelmann. Is this also the way you're thinking of, like, which kind of sciences are asked for political advice?
Partly, yes, of course. I mean, you wouldn't want to ask me for sustainable food systems. So topic is important. What I would also throw into the mix is, of course, what kind of scientific method is used. And again, if I just take one of my own disciplines, sociology, as a example, that's been called a multi-paradigm science. So there is not just one established rule how to do sociology, but there are different paradigms well established in sociology. So you would actually have to look for a balanced solution there, because you can't just give the voice to, let's say, those people who produce quantitative based policy advice, right? You also need to include qualitative data. So that's another distinction. And I think this is why the institutional work is so important, because we are constantly underestimating, I think, in our picture of science, the vastness and complexity of the sciences. I mean, you can make these kind of decisions in all kinds of fields, but they will have to be specific to the field, right? In archaeology, you have completely different subdivisions that you might want to take into account when asked a specific question. So that's why I think it's important to keep track of these complexities, and I don't see a way around such complex institutions in order to do that. Let me just make one remark also on the topic of the separation of politics and science, because again, I think, like I've now argued, that the sciences are complex, politics is no less complex, right? And I mean, you know best, but what I would like to do is draw a distinction between a wider and a more narrow concept of politics. So the narrow concept of politics is that which we often have in mind, right? Politics in terms of institutions, in terms of legally constituted institutions. But there's, of course, also a wider aspect of politics, and science is by no means devoid of that wider political aspect, right? We fight all the time who gets to say what and where, who gets to chair which committee, and so on. So there's an internal politics within science, and in that sense, the separation is not as clear-cut as you might think it is.
Okay, thank you. And by saying that it's complicated to like choose the right way to include scientific-based recommendations into the political decisions, do you have like anything in mind? Maybe that's already a bit like talking about future, but I'm very interested. Do you have anything in mind how a process like that could look like? Like how could be an ideal decision-making process with including scientists?
So I'm very bad at outlining ideals because I'm more interested in looking at what's actually there and trying, first of all, to understand what's there. And I think, I mean, the institutional procedures just described, they have certain ideals, right? The ideal of a balanced, of balance, of diversity, and so on. So I think these, if you look for ideals, you are looking at a very abstract level, these kind of decision makers, and then you can look at, for example, I think the most interesting work in the last 15, 20 years has come from feminist philosophy of science in that field, who've emphasized really the idea of diversity, the idea of heterogeneity, the idea of novel ontologies that have to play a role when you look at the sciences and try to include more diverse voices in the decision-making process of what to report as evidence and how to constitute evidence. So if you want to look for ideals, I think these are the offers that philosophy of science can give you.
Unless you don't like it, thank for the thoughtful idea. So, as many voices mentioned, that politics and as well as sciences are complex fields, and like it's complicated to work in both fields. Maybe Bettina Stark-Watzinger, do you have some skills for us you really need to be a good politician?
A politician? Well, stay curious, stay open-minded, and try to actually enter into debates and listen, and not only sending what you think, which is very difficult in the political arena. And I mean, so many things have been said that are quite important. First of all, the complexity, and we as a politician, the expectations people have is to give a clear answer, a clear way, and you know, there's a crisis, and you know how we will be out of the crisis in 5 years. But what we've learned is, is that the nature of things is complex, and so bringing the two worlds together and also enabling us as politicians to have that openness is maybe rooms where there's confidence, maybe behind closed doors, where you can have open questions and open debates without, you know, having to do that publicly, but also the rooms for discussion is important to get this complexity, because then you have to converge some sort of, right? Also, I mean, I'm in a coalition with three very different partners. But we have, our task is in the end to converge and come to a common, you know, common legislation process and things like that. And having this room for discussion, I think when you look at at society, it would be good if we could understand more and learn more from research and science, that you know, all we know now is what we know now, but what we will know in 10 years might be quite different, so we will make mistakes. And as a politician, you're not really allowed to make mistakes. So having these rooms where we can learn without, but then also that science understands that we have to give a clear, if you write a law, that's something you have to write a law, and you cannot say on the one hand and on the other, on the one side, on the other side, you have to write a law. So this conversion process, I think there you have to be open as a politician and understanding the complexity. But this is something also society has to understand, because otherwise we will all follow the ones who give easy answers.
The societal demand for a clear structure, a clear mind, brings me to the topic of evidence-based policymaking. Cornelia Woll, could you illustrate for us what we currently understand?
So I would agree with Bettina Stark-Watzinger, who said it's an imperative for politicians to consider the evidence at hand, and I think they're getting very good at doing this. There's a lot of even obligations to gather information about what has research produced and insights for the questions we're asking ourselves. The challenge is that the time horizons are just so different. A lot of the crises and of the last couple of years have shown us that politics need to act within a very short space of time, and they will go and gather evidence as much as they can. But how do you do that in a way that you can meet the time schedules? Because scientists can work quickly as well, but then we are not sure if it's true. And the favorite method for making sure our findings are actually confirmed is called the peer review, and it lasts for 3, 4, 5 years. So even if I did research on the urgent question today, it will be confirmed 5 years from now. So there's a time horizon question that is quite challenging. And you asked about the best system to make sure science and politics meets. Well, let's think of what has been done, in particular in the pandemic. I think the management of the pandemic, to me, was a very good exercise, also comparative experiment, if you will, in different countries that were trying to come to an action that was immediate, in a way that was as inclusive of scientific insights as possible. So what did most countries do? Most countries had a consultation process with a panel of scientists of some sort, where scientists were brought in to advise on the best course of action. Now, here the challenge was exactly what Frida Vogelmann just mentioned. Which scientific expertise? So we all knew epidemiology was important, but what we didn't know probably in the early days was, well, there was a lot of social uptake questions. Can you impose certain constraints on a population in this or in that way? What are the legal implications? What are the social implications? What are even the interactions? I only realized today at a meeting of one of the academies that epidemiology is a social science. And of course it is, because how a virus spreads depends on the social interactions we have. I always thought it was medicine, but fine. So there's all these different scientific expertises you need, and that's already a challenge that you need to organize in the most plural possible way, and you don't want the committee to be 150 members, because else they won't form an opinion. And of course, I'm sure you all heard the joke, if you want advice on a question from 5 economists, just put them in a room and you'll get 8 different opinions. So the challenge is you have to mix a set of people and have them give you advice. But then the second challenge is, who will speak for the scientific results based on what method? Because the methods are important. We have a lot of very great scientists that I can respect for their field of work, but they've turned into pandemic experts and then war experts, and tomorrow they will be energy and inflation experts, even though their scientific expertise might be somewhere else. We're all uneasy about this, but it happens. So the fact that somebody is called Frau Professor Dr. HC doesn't mean that she's an expert on the particular question that she's giving her opinion on. That's the first issue. And the second is even if I was asked about my research, I'm also not good at sustainable food systems, but even about my personal research, which nobody ever asked me my opinion about in politics, I don't know why, I wouldn't be sure to give you the best possible advice, because I'm quite aware of all the unanswered questions, and I just am very happy. I'll let you give you my favorite example. I wrote an entire book about bank bailouts during the financial crisis. I've looked at 6 countries, how it's done. And I am just the happiest person in the world that I had never had to make a single decision about bailing out banks, because you can only get it wrong. And the people who did have to make these decisions really had their stomachs tied up in knots, and the politicians are still trembling from what that period was. So yes, I can produce insights to reduce this uncertainty, but how is that going to guide political action is a very delicate task. So back to the original question, why I think the fluid approach is good is not in terms of careers. You're right. It's not you're not a top scientist and then you're a very good politician for 8 years and then you're a top scientist. But I think that top scientists can be identified in somehow a good way, and possibly with some diversity increasingly playing into account, can come in certain expert committees, like on the energy price discussion in Germany, but then should be invited to go back out. What I'm most uneasy about is that certain people who are very good at speaking nice, simple sentences about some findings that they've vaguely worked on, and so they're constantly in the expert committee here or some other committee there, and they just occupy the space, and you become a political figure. And that is something I'm uneasy about, and let me just add this as a concluding thing. In the introduction to this panel, you asked, wouldn't the solution be to have a clinical scientist, a scientist who works on the object that he or she researches? And my answer is, not in politics, for the very simple reason that for a medical scientist, if you're a clinical scientist, you work on whatever it is you're researching in the body that's ahead of you. As a political scientist, you become part of the process. It is as if you asked me to operate on my own body in order to find out what politics does to me. And I just don't think that's a good way of guiding action, because you're part of the system. You become a representative of an authority in this and that way. You become politicized, whether you want it or not. And that's a very different type of experiment.
I come to that back later in a second, but I got a question. By mentioning the scientists being like experts for war or a pandemic or whatever they want in that moment, do you think we should hold them more to account for their political related recommendations?
To a certain degree, maybe we are, but that's why you talked about failure. Politicians are not so good at making mistakes. I don't think scientists are great at making mistakes either. I mean, we do get our publications rejected all the time, and so apparently that's supposed to make you learn failure, but I still think we're not so good at it. And so we give advice, and then it's wrong, and then we say, scientific method. Of course, you can always be proven wrong. We're in this because of the game. We'll be proven wrong, but that helps us ask better questions, and so the scientific insight will increase as a result. So of course I can be wrong, because that's just normal. But in politics, that is consequential. You're giving an advice at that moment in time, and then a collective actually moved into the wrong direction. So that is very hard to shoulder, and that's why the work of politicians is, I think, more difficult than the ones of scientists, because they have to stand up for whatever decisions it is they made, and it can be a terribly wrong decision. If the scientists are terribly wrong, well, then their experiment failed, and they're looking in a different direction, and hopefully they're going to find a better answer in the future. So it is, I think, a little bit more comfortable, but that's my personal opinion.
Frida Vogelmann, you want to step in here?
Well, just, I mean, I feel that I would like to mention at least one point, I think, where we disagree, and that is, of course, that when you describe the way in which the political scientist becomes part of the process as a political figure, I mean, the old line that you probably all know from critical theory is, of course, the insight that science is not outside society. So the sciences work as social practices. They are instituted in a political way. I mean, we get funding for the universities that is politically mandated. So you are never, in that sense, outside of the process which you are intervening in. And I think it's really important to make, to be clear about that. As a scientist, you do not step outside. I think it's importantly wrong to think of science as something attaining a perspective beyond society. That's not what we do, and that's not what we can do, and we shouldn't pretend that we do it. So that's just one way of disagreeing.
But let me just respond. Yeah. I don't disagree with you on this. I think that's very true. I think you can never be outside. But if you just write it in an article and somebody reads the article and reads it in whatever political way, that's one thing. If you're moving into political advice and you're saying in a much more politically communicated way, I have the answer that the government should follow, and the government did not cut off energy to Russia, and even though we had all the data that, etc., you're engaging much more with the political process, not just with the production of insights. And I think in the spectrum of where people recognize what your place is, that's a different step than just being political, and of course, producing the knowledge we do that is never entirely outside. I agree with that.
By mentioning the growing societal demand for scientific-based political decisions, Lara, Keuck, is there proof that scientific evidence contributes the acceptance and also the support of political decisions?
Well, I'm not aware of data. Maybe others are. But what I was thinking during this discussion is. I think it's really important, and that has been mentioned before, that we address the different relationships between possible interactions of science or sciences and policy making. And one example, just to illustrate how things can get wrong, has been in a very nice book, The Merchants of Doubt, been described by Naomi Oreskes, where she looked at how tobacco industry lobbyists sort of really used this idea of we can never be sure, there is scientific doubt, to counteract that there will be regulation against tobacco use for a very long time. And quite similar things have been happening then with like people arguing that climate change is like not really an established scientific fact where we can doubt, and so on. So I think what I want to get at is I do think scientific evidence and policy making is related in various ways, and it is often used as sort of like a legitimation for certain political acts or not to do a certain political act. And it can be weaponized, as has been mentioned before. So I do think that it's kind of like, it's true that there's always doubt in science. It's also true, as we said, that it's important to question things. But then there are like certain aspects where we can say, you know, we are sure enough that there is a climate crisis, we should act. We can then say where there are certain questions that still need to be resolved. But the question then is like, how does that really relate then to political decision making? So I think it's quite important to see that there can be different argumentative roles that pointing to scientific evidence can play for policy making, but also that there can be different epistemic roles. So what is the status of the knowledge that we actually have about something within this process? And that again is something that even scientists who are working in the field sometimes cannot oversee themselves, right? So you need even their sometimes additional expertise, right? But it's I think that's just like one point that I'd really like to make in this round, that the concept of evidence-based is often used in sort of like a very narrow way. And it is important that we see that the quality of the evidence can be quite different, but also what it means to base it on can be quite different. And that's maybe also why I don't really have kind of a good idea about data that could prove that, because that would already mean that we have like a very clear understanding what we would be looking for to address that question.
So do you think with additional expertise and control of the quality of the evidence, that could be ways how to strengthen the trust in science and their politics?
Well, there's a nice saying that expertise needs an object. And I think that's kind of, you know, it's sort of like no one is just an expert, right? You're an expert for something. Right? And that also means that if you have an expertise in something, you might have an interest in shaping objects in a way that you're an expert for that object. But other people coming from different fields might have an interest in looking at it differently. And that's like one of the insights from feminist philosophy of science, saying that we might be confronted with something that Miranda Fricker has been calling epistemic injustice, right? That there are certain people who have something really relevant to say about what the object in question is that are not being heard. And then they are not considered as experts because people think it's irrelevant to ask, like the canonical example is that people who have experienced sexual harassment have not been kind of like, their experience has not been included into like the social scientist concept of sexual harassment. And I mean, of course, then you get very different examples and very different data out of that. So I think it's kind of I'm doing the same move as you're doing. I'm kind of like saying, well, you know, this question is kind of, I understand where you're coming from, but I think that we cannot give like one simple question, one simple answer to that question without risking that we oversimplify the concept of expertise.
As the world is easier with simple answers, we thought we'd try. Frieder Vogelmann, you want to step in?
No, I just want to reinforce this point. I think the concepts science, politics, and evidence are what you could call dangerous collective singulars, right? They present to you something that seems to be one thing, but if you actually look at them, they are several, and hence the relation between them cannot be just one relation, right? Because you have to open them up. And I think that, I mean, for me, this is really one of the key insights that has been developed in philosophy of science, because we are slow learners. I think the history and sociology of science has been a bit faster in that. But still, it's important. Do not talk of the relationship between science and politics in the singular and improve it by evidence in the singular. That will simply not work.
Thanks for illustrating that so structured for us. So I want to bring in another topic. So my question goes to Frieder Vogelmann again. And so I'm asking, how does journalism and the media contribute to our understanding and perception of the collaboration between politics and science?
Oh, okay, so this is only partly within my area of expertise. So I'm going to say something very tentative. Because, no, I mean, as we just learned, right, it's important to have some epistemic humility, as my field would call it. But I can relate, I think, to something that the minister said. What we need is room for debate where we do not feel compelled to judge in lightning speed, right? And I think that a lot of the development in not just social media, but actually what is sometimes called qualitative media, has taken a very different turn. So we want judgment now, we want it hard, we want it snappy, and we want to have, it should be entertaining as well at best. So I think these are ingredients that really are detrimental to having a meaningful debate, but I wouldn't limit that, as I said, to social media. That is not I mean, it's a problem not of the medium in that sense, it's a problem of the political economy that drives the news industry. And that's something where it's very hard to envision different solutions, because that is so tied up with our economic system, with our political system, with our scientific system. I mean, we have the same problem in science in a different manner, right? Publish or perish is the slogan here. So I think and I don't know how, but I think what would be really important is to give ourselves, but also the others that we disagree with, more time to make their arguments in a meaningful way. But I'm completely aware that I don't think we will ever see that.
Okay, I mean, it seems logical to me that if we are overwhelmed with information, we are trying to use heuristics to decide what we are thinking, and so we do tend to believe what so-called experts are telling us in the famous media. Yeah, you want to step in here?
No, but I mean, historically, that doesn't mean that we have to have these snappy judgments, right? I mean, there's a very old and probably bad book by Neil Postman. We are amusing ourselves to death. But one thing that he observes merely historically is very interesting. So how long did a usual political debate in the election cycle in the US, how long were these debates, right? And in the 19th century, usually they lasted for 5 hours. So that's something that we can't even really seem to think about, right? But it just points to the fact that there are other ways of dividing up the time that we allow ourselves to come to a conclusion. So I don't think there is not even in the information age a necessity to use these fast heuristics. It's just the way in which our social practices are set up that it necessitates those.
Okay, so to transition this theoretical concept into practical implementation, I'm asking you, Cornelia Woll, as several professors of the Hertie School can be seen like giving political advice, scientific based in the media. Are there like any regulations for them? Is that controlled or?
So the most important principle for scientists is always that they have academic freedom. So they are supposed to be able to ask their own questions, find their own answers, and if they have answers and they want like to go out into public with them, then that's great. But if I disagree with so do I encourage them? All good scientific institutions will say, if you have something to say, then go out and make sure it's heard, but don't just be on television for the sake of being on television. And I have had a lot of conversations with, in particular, the younger colleagues to also warn against the spiral you're getting into, because the politicians can tell you better than I could, but the interesting thing with media is they don't call you when you're an expert on the question. They call you because you've answered the phone the last time. And if they call you again, they're hoping you'll answer again. And so it's a spiral. Once you've answered twice or three times, then you're on television all the time, not because you're an expert on all of these questions. And so it's a bit of a spiral that takes a lot of time out of your day. And of course, as the head of an institution, I like to see them on television because I know it's good for our communication strategy. But as the chief scientist, I don't like it because it takes so much time out of the research they can produce. So what's the regulation? The regulation that I think is most important is that we do not tell them what they can say or not say, as long as they respect the scientific principles, which are to be respectful, have certain limits, etc. And so I'm yet worried because our faculty is just wonderful and has not crossed the boundaries. But I've been in link with institutions where the head has had a faculty member who's a great expert on one thing, but then started a YouTube channel on conspiracy theories of the pandemic, on the other hand, as the professor of this institution, and then you're in a bind, because what do you say? The person will always say academic freedom, and then you say there's nothing academic about what you're doing on your YouTube channel, and then they say freedom of speech, and then you're saying, is it freedom of speech, or are you actually negatively impacting, and what do I do? And really it's hurting the reputation of our institution. And so that's a very difficult challenge. So we of course, back to the Hertie School, where we don't have these problems, thankfully. We try to reward media presence to a certain degree, but we always say we reward scientific production more, and that is the more intensive part of what they do. They have a lot of volumes of hour to teach, and I think with that so far, and the community culture where we are trying to be interested in fundamental research and really the insights that come out of protocols that are tested, that we respect, that are discussed. Right now I'm at ease. I hope it'll stay this way.
Yeah, being a scientist, one is normally rewarded with grants or particular high publications, and now in a special way at the Hertie School. Bettina, Stark-Watzinger, are there any further plans for structural rewardment on federal level?
Well, let me first say, I had a meeting with journalists in a closed room one day, and my first question, and I was allowed to ask them questions, so we flipped around, and my first question was, what kind of person do you have to be if you are a headline texter? I mean, headlines are just, you know, they want you to click on the article. And I think it was last week, a neuroscientist in one of the talk shows, which I only put in my ears when I run, because then I run faster. I don't watch them on television. Was giving some empirical evidence that over the last whatever years, the negativity in headlines doubled by 300. So 300 times, 300%. Sorry, 300%. Here we go. And if you see that, and why do they do that? Because the media wants us to click on these articles. They want to attract us. They want to lure us in. So, and I think that does something with communication. And then again, if you're a scientist and you're part of that, you can be drawn into something that is very difficult for you. And like with politicians, credibility is your part of of who you are and how you're seen. Beside the fact that publications, but so that is quite difficult for scientists then to enter that playing field. What we want to do from the ministry side, and I think that's something, and we work closely together with research community, is have this scientific communication. Having platforms and also trainings and seeing that as part of the job description, because yes, it is difficult if you give time to other things than research. For example, I wanted one of my state secretaries to be a scientist, And I was really, really happy that my state secretary didn't say no, because I was well aware of the fact that I would withdraw her out of the scientific community, and that would do something to her career. So we have to see in other countries like the US, I don't know if they do everything better, but even as a young scientist, research communication is some sort of part of how you are evaluated. And if that is not part of what you do, of part of your job description, then it's very difficult. On top of the fact that you enter a different playing ground, which has other sort of rules, and then you might be drawn into something where you don't want to be. I have to say, I'm very happy that the scientists have this intrinsic motivation very often, because it's on top of what they do, despite maybe some also liking to be in media. I really appreciate that highly, because it affects what you do and it takes part of your time, but we need it, and that is why I would underline, maybe with a different twist, that yes, research scientific community is not outside society, is part of society, and their contribution is so important.
Thank you. As we're slightly running out of time, and I want to bring in one more topic. If we think about a new structure for like bridging this gap between science and politics, and we think about a person who is trained in both, in sciences and scientific research, and also in like doing politics, political making scientist, so to say. Could this person has the allowance to vote in the parliament? Lara Keuck, maybe?
Well, I would say if there's a democratic mandate, right? I mean, I think that there are very good reasons why we have a democracy. And although it sometimes might seem that things might be easier if we had an expertocracy, right? I don't think that, we should... let's say the price would be very, very high, and I think that's something that really needs to be considered, right? So, I think it's just I mean, when we were first talking about that, I was saying I was kind of like surprised that you were suggesting something like, oh, the scientists should have a role in the parliament, like the Schöffen have in the courtyard, in the court, because I don't think that the scientists are necessarily the best to have like a common sense approach, which I would say is kind of like what the Schöffen. It's like one important role that the Schöffen have, right? But it's more that they might serve a role giving concrete. Acting as more like a Gutachter in the court, right? As if you really have sort of like a question where you need some more evidence, and you can then by certain procedures identify someone who can contribute something to that. Then I think it's something that would be really nice to have that also kind of like in the parliament, and not just in the closed rooms. I think they are like important places for both, right? But the vote is, I think, something that is a very important, sort of like democratic exercise, exactly. But I mean, this is something that people who are like in political theory should answer more than I do. This is just kind of like this. I'm saying this as a citizen, I guess, and not as kind of like a scholar who is like particularly, working on political science. But it just seems to me that while we can say yes, science is part of society. I don't see why scientists should have a stronger mandate than people who are elected.
you want to step in?
Just a two-finger. I think, and you said it perfectly well, I couldn't have said it better, but asking this question shows you that we're looking at the intersection of science and politics because we think that science or the sciences can give a better answer. But what we just heard in all the let's take a step back answers was a lot of times the scientists are just the one that help you to ask the better questions, because they deconstruct the way in which with which we're getting at it, and they help us to redefine the questions. And I'd even go so far that I think we're living at a time where all the answers are already out there and everybody can get them, because, you know, we have even artificial intelligence now discovering, what is it, antibiotics. And I mean, there's so many things that you have at your fingertips, but how do you navigate this world, and how do you ask exactly the right questions that help you to make the difficult choices? I think science has a contribution to make, but that means they shouldn't be there standing with in Parliament to help us find the right answer. They should be the ones guiding the process of determining which way to go.
Highlighting the importance of to strengthen our democracy, and why having an audience full of people who are either interested in science or politics or even both. Do you have like any piece of advice for the future for the future for us?
Advice for?
Advice for all of us, like the next generation.
I think what would be wonderful, I always love if people come and do, you know, spend some weeks in our offices, because I think the understanding of each other, learning to use the language both sides have to use in their daily routines is important, and also transparent and open discussions, because what we said here is giving advice is great, and I think having to counter-argue what scientists say is also testing us. So as a voter, you should always you know, listen to both sides and then see how they interact and what the arguments are, taking into account that uncertainties, they're not using it as an excuse not to listen to science, and to be interested in politics and look into the inside. And whenever I had people in my office in Bundestag, they left differently from when they came in. So again, having, you know, bridging the gaps between the various fields, all being part of one society, but the different spheres, I think that would be great also as a voter. And yes, we fought so long for our democracy, and one vote for every person free, and, you know, I think that is something so important. So let's work together, but stick to our democratic rules.
Thanks for this thoughtful advisement. So before we proceed to questions from the audience, we'd like to express our gratitude to you, Bettina Stark-Watzinger. Thanks for your grateful participation in our discussion, providing us insights, topic related to on the federal level. And yeah, we were happy to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm not rushing off because I'm frightened to answer your questions. It's because our Minister of Transport and whatever, mobility, still has to build faster trains between Hessen and Berlin. No, but thank you for being here. And I always love to be out of the ministry and follow a discussion, because you always leave it with more insight and also some inspiration. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here.
A round of applause.
Discussion.
So before we start the open discussion round, I've got two more questions for you, the audience. My first question to you is, like, after hearing a lot of these topics mentioned, how should science and politics interact, in your opinion? There are three optional answers, and you can choose between. First answer is as two separate systems. Second option is in cooperation with clear boundaries. And third option is in cooperation with shared policy-making processes. Okay, so who would choose answer number one? Remind of the answers. Reminder? Like the first possible answer is as two separate systems. Second option is in cooperation with clear boundaries. And third option is in cooperation with shared policy-making processes. Okay, another option to raise your hand for number one. Okay. Now let's check for option two. And now for option three. Okay, I think most of our audience would say they should act in cooperation with clear boundaries. And yeah, my second question, it's yes or no question, is would you vote potentially a scientist representing your opinion in the federal parliament? Okay, so first option is yes.
Sorry, can you clarify the question? Could be a member of parliament who just happens to be a scientist, or are you going back to your thing from before where a member, a scientist who goes to the parliament, he's not elected, and then gets to vote?
No, it's a scientist. It's a scientist, and you can vote for him to be part of the parliament. Okay, so pardon?
Could be a policeman, a teacher, or anybody, right?
Sure.
No question. So let me design a political system here. So you get one additional seat. It's the scientist seat. You get to vote somebody in, and she or he is then representing insights from scientific research, or just voting as a regular member of parliament? Basically, are you doing a professional seat assignment? Or is it just a science expert who's always voting in parliament? No, we're just clarifying.
Okay, I think we have to, yeah, as Leah said, we have to skip this to the next discussion. So, yeah, to get most out of today's discussion, now it's your time to ask questions to our wonderful panelists. So just raise your hand and we will weave in your questions.
Yeah, hi. Rodrigo Jimenez from Public Policy Master 2019. I come from Mexico, and I wrote my question to be more efficient and, yeah, go faster. So I would like to introduce an element in this discussion that has to do with the relationship between politics and science, and it's the topic of politicization of science. And what I mean is, in countries such as mine, there is this discussion about scientific sovereignty, which is, on the one hand, it has to do with creating the knowledge and innovation needed for adequate well-being or for a national development. But on the other hand, also has to do with political ideology against foreign science or imposed knowledge, imposed innovation. So here, I would really like to ask, from your point of view in this discussion of politics and science, how does this work when we are talking about science that is, of course, yes, in some countries we want it, but only for the decisions that are somehow going in the direction that we would like to go as a country, no? So, yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. To who do you want to address that question to in first place?
To whomever feels interested.
We can collect several. If you want, we can have several questions,
and then we will further discuss. Okay, then we will collect some questions.
Hi. Hi, I'm Sebastian. I am currently still at the Hertie School, and I'm wondering, or politics is one term, but democracy, I guess, is another term. And I was wanting to ask, isn't the foundation of science some sort of philosophical realism that there is one true thing, one truth that we can observe, while in democracy, isn't the foundation here that there are at least two plausible options where you can choose, and there isn't one that is clearly wrong, sort of a priori. So can politics or can science tell us what we want, or can it only tell us how we get there, I guess, in a sense?
As we're having two complex questions yet, should we start with discussing, or would you rather collect some more?
You're the master of the ceremony, but I'm interested to hear what the questions are in general, and since we only have limited time.
Okay, then we go on.
I like questions. One more, and then we take a stab.
Hi, I'm Janine from the MPP 2010. A couple of years ago, I was part of a team that had to organize a commission that will give advice to the government. I'm not saying which commission, I'm not saying which ministry. That could cost me my job probably. But we try to do a little bit what you, Frida, said, so try to get people from all kinds of different methodologies. It was a commission half women, half men. Try to get people from opposing sides of the sciences. It was a disaster. They totally couldn't agree on anything, wrote 500 pages, which basically said nothing, and their conclusions were like what they could get to, which was, common sense. So the question I learned something out of process, which is I will never want to be part of organizing a scientific committee ever again in my life. But if I had to do it again, there were some conclusions, but they were not the real conclusions, what we really could have done better to get good advice. And I think we might need more scientific research on exactly this. How can you organize scientific support for politics, and what would be a good way that in the end you get, I don't know, what I wanted were 10 pages saying me, please do this, and I didn't get it.
Thanks. So Lara, Keuck, maybe you want to start, relating to the question how to create good scientific advice and maybe also to the growing polarization of science?
Well, I think maybe you cannot really expect consensus decisions from a scientific committee, right? Because I think and that goes kind of like in that direction, right? I mean, a consensus sort of closes the discussion at some point, right? I mean, you can then say we'll reopen it again, but I'm not sure if the scientific commissions produce consensus papers, then often it's after a lot of debate, right? And that it goes a bit to the point that you mentioned with your book, and you're being happy not to give advice. I'm working on the history and philosophy of medical classification systems, and I can tell you a lot of what went wrong and how these consensus decisions were being made and remade and revised, but it's really difficult to say how would I organize it differently, right? I can say, well, okay, you have to be clear about certain things, but I think sort of these three questions speak to each other in an interesting way, right? It's the way science is organized here, and I think also for very good reasons, is that we value a lot the freedom of research, that it's not guided by political ideology. And that means also that there might be things that are not that relevant, even if you have kind of people who might, on first sight, be interesting from a methodological point of view, right? But it's not so much oriented towards necessarily consensus decision making. So I don't think that I have a good answer on how to make it better, except that maybe this is really kind of a task where you need people who are in between this bringing for the scientific debate, and then thinking about what can we do to actually translate that into something that you can then work with, right? But I'm quite sure that not all of your scientists in the committee will be happy with what you produce. I think that's just also part of the differences. So I guess I don't think that no matter how well we organize everything, that there can be a world without friction. I also think that it's not desirable. But there is a cost for that.
Cornelia Woll, you agree on that?
Yes, and I, in a way, it's very interesting to hear this experience. I think that's the rule, and the exception are the ones that go well, but there are some that go well, and I'm unaware of scientific research of how to get to the ones that work well. If I do, I'll send them your way. But it is the exception. I do think that also the distinction between what do we want and how do we get there is important. And let me do it again with the, maybe let me just tell you a very, very quick story. I at one point was at the initiative of creating an interdisciplinary center for the evaluation of public policy. And it was social scientists, basically economists and the other people. And the economists are very at ease with some very mechanistic, you push this button here and it moves something there. So how you get there is just a small causal experiment, and that's what the politicians are looking for. Whereas all the other social scientists were deconstructing the questions. You're not asking this right, this is classified, you're having bad priors, and have you thought about the social uptake? And so this entire exercise, this public policy evaluation, didn't correspond to the type of work that a lot of social scientists are used to doing, because they reformat questions, and I think that's really important. But if you want, in politics, usually you already have an idea of what you need to get to, but you want to find out what is the best way to get there. So if you ask that very precise question, and that is limiting, that means you're not going to take everything into account. You're trying to probably be as pluralistic as you can possibly be, but in a very limited exercise. Maybe you get somewhere, but it's also not going to be as broad as you could possibly be if you just ask the question as an intellectual exercise. And Rodrigo, about scientific sovereignty. So I didn't know about this discussion. This is also about national sovereignty and not having foreign scientific insights dominate the discussion in one country. So that's interesting. I would say with Frida here, that's very interesting, because even though we don't have this discussion, for example, in Germany, I suspect everybody's under foreign influence. All the ideas that are floating around are coming from somewhere, because it's political, not just in party politics terms, but also in terms of national interest. And then sometimes people wake up and say, oh, the evil, social scientist reference, the evils of nudging in public administration, and look where it's coming from. And now we have transhumanism coming from Silicon Valley to etc. And so these ideas travel, and you can trace them, but they're bound to happen anywhere. So if the idea of scientific sovereignty is to push back against it, I would say good luck. I'm not sure you'll get very far, or you just say, well, then let's not consult with scientists because you suspect that they're mobile and you're not, and you're the defender of the national interest as a politician, which doesn't sound like the people I would vote for, but I leave that up to Mexican politics.
So I guess that leaves the philosophical or scientific realism, as the position is called in philosophy of science, to me. And the quick answer is yes, that is one position you can take in philosophy of science. Probably the dominant position, but it faces some extremely hard challenges. And I'll just give you two and then let you ponder about them. So one is what's called the underdetermination problem in science. So no empirical evidence ever determines the theory that accounts for it. For every evidence, because empirical evidence is finite, you have an infinity of possible theories that can explain that evidence. So there is no one-to-one connection there, and that means that there is no single theory, right? That's the one part. The other part is more looking back at the history and saying, that's called, for some reason, pessimistic meta-induction. Look at the history of the sciences. Your chances of getting it right are so small that it's hubris to think that you are better off than all the people that came before you. So why would the one thing that you've discovered be the true nature? So if you are inclined into this way of thinking, then it's really hard to make an argument for scientific realism, because again, you would have to argue that no, we are for some reason luckily born in the time where we finally got it right, and that's hard to argue for.
But then again, hubris is common in science and in politics. So
yeah, but it's not advised.
Okay, I think we have more time for like one short question.
Hello, I'm Julius. I'm also one of the current Hertie students, also working at the Ministry of Defense. And I was part of the minority earlier that was hesitant to say there should be a strong interconnection because I think there is another step to it, and that is science communication. And my very simple question is, who bears this responsibility? Is it more on the side of politicians that have to give simplistic answers to very complex questions for society? Or is it rather with the scientists that still have to make their research applicable or graspable for the public?
Frieda Vogelmann, can you illustrate for us if it's either this or that, or maybe more like a crisis?
I think you're forgetting the one person or type of person that was traditionally responsible for it, and that's journalists, science journalists, who are actually trained in communicating scientific research results in a way that is understandable to the lay public. And I think this is I would argue that this is really an important mediator, and I'm not quite happy with what the minister said there, because I think there is a certain tendency of tagging this job onto scientists in Germany as well. And I think that's just a bad idea. Yes, you should be able to translate your work into more understandable terms, but you are not, as a scientist, you are not primarily concerned with that, and you shouldn't be. Your primary concern should be to your research, and probably, hopefully, to your teaching. But the question really is, for me, how much jobs do you want the scientists to take on? And I think it's a bad idea to simply say, well, they can take all the jobs. No, we have actually trained people for that, and they were once called scientific journalists.
Okay, just a 10-second, but I think the challenge is in the media, and that's something that I didn't say when the question was asked. In media, maybe you have scientific journalists who are above this, but most of the time the question is on any one topic. You will get, here's the scientist who argues for it, and here's the scientist who argues against it. And so for 20 years, we were thinking that maybe climate change wasn't man-made, because they always found one person under a rock that said, no, it's not. And then at one point, we said, well, tell us, what is the percentage of people who are strongly arguing for one thing? Because there is such a thing as probability in scientific opinion that you don't get out of the media, because that's just not that interesting. They want the fight over something. And if you're asking for the Ministry of Defense, do you really want now to read in a journal the one scientist who says, yes, let's go to war, even though there's a nuclear risk, and then the other one says, oh, nuclear risk, and then they turn out to be wrong. I mean, they're not going to be responsible for it, so it is a challenge.
So thanks for the challenging last statement. So let me sum up. After investigating the current state of the interface between politics and science, we gained insights into the practical implementation of theoretical concepts. It is crucial to improve our understanding of both the theory of politics and science independent of collaborative efforts. In summary, to highlight the importance of fostering strong connection, it can be stated that enhancing communication holds the offer to numerous benefits. While new approaches may offer potential solutions, they always come with their own set of challenges. We express our appreciation to our esteemed panelists for sharing their valuable perspectives, representing diverse backgrounds within the dynamic interplay between politics and science. Our deepest gratitude goes to the Hertie Foundation, with notable acknowledgement for their invaluable guidance provided by our mentors Eva Koch and Sergej Schnotzko. We are grateful to have the opportunity to explore and pursue our interests in such broad contexts. A round of applause for all these people, please. This event marks the beginning of this year's Hertie Summit, where 700 fellows gather to exchange knowledge and ideas. The summit will continue tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at the Harnack House, featuring a diverse array of workshops, followed by a joint session and in the delightful ending of a summer party. We're looking forward to meeting you there. Thank you.